So I know a lot of drama schools ask for 1-minute monologues when it comes to drama school auditions. Now that can be tricky because a lot of Shakespearean monologues are longer than that. So today I want to talk about how to cut your Shakespearean monologue. And before I jump in, I just want to say if you're working towards a drama school audition or any audition, I have 2 playlists on my channel homepage that I recommend you have a look at. There's plenty of videos in there to help you prep. One is called Drama School Auditions and one is called Get Better at Shakespeare. Look at those and you're going to be so much better than most of the people in the room. So please do it. I'll link them below. Now let's jump into cutting. The first thing I want to say about cutting is don't. If you can possibly not cut, don't cut. That might mean that you need to spend a little bit longer finding an appropriate length monologue. And I know that sucks sometimes. I have written a post with a list of shorter monologues that I quite like that you might want to look at as a starting point. But I know that sometimes you really have your heart set on a different monologue that you think is perfect for you and your skills and your casting type. And so I'm going to walk you through the steps of how to cut if you really need to. The first step is look for cuts at the beginning or end of the monologue. It is much easier to cut, just trim from either end so you're still kind of getting the shape of the monologue. Ideally, you don't want to be cutting from the middle. The reason for this is that you're changing the structural integrity of the monologue. It's good to keep in mind that these monologues, Shakespeare didn't need to write these monologues a particular length. It's not a sonnet, it doesn't need to be 14 lines, and it's not like, I think it was Dickens that was like paid by the word, so everything's really long. It wasn't like that. He could have made it any length, and he chose that length to make sure that the character gave the audience enough information if there's new things happening, but also to take the character on a journey that allows them to further the plot. It's basically like a song in musical theatre. I would say probably more time efficient, but everything in the monologue is there for a reason. So if you really feel like you can't cut from the ends and you need to cut from the middle, what you actually need to do is understand the reason each section of the text is there, so you can make sure you're not cutting the really essential stuff. So let me walk you through it step by step, and I'll use an example too. First, start by dividing your monologue into beats or like chunks of usually about 2 to 4 lines, and it really should be kind of one main thought in each of those chunks. Then I want you to look at what happens in each chunk. Why is it there? And I want you to describe in one sentence why each chunk is there. Usually it's either that the character is giving new information to the audience, or they're making a decision, or they're furthering kind of their emotional growth. So it's kind of like raising the stakes. Now, once you've labeled each of those chunks, you're going to understand what's really necessary to the monologue that you really can't take away because the audience is not going to understand, or you're not going to get the kind of emotional arc. You're not going to get the dramatic arc that you need, and therefore it's not going to be a good you're probably not going to be able to act it very well because it's not enough for you to work with. Sometimes what happens in a monologue, what you'll find is there might be 2 lines and 2 lines next to each other that are kind of similar. They kind of say the same thing, and you might be able to remove one of those and it will still make sense to the audience. Let's look now at an example. Helena's monologue from A Midsummer Night's Dream. It starts with, "Lo, she is one of this confederacy." I get asked about this a fair bit because it's quite a long monologue and it's tricky to cut because a lot of what she's saying is important, it does provide new information, and it also has quite a strong dramatic arc. So taking out a big section of it can really impact how well you're able to perform that arc. But let's look at each of the little beats and what they mean, and I can show you how you can kind of decide between things so you can apply it to your own monologue. So she starts with, "Lo, she is one of this confederacy. Now I perceive they have conjoined all 3 to fashion this false sport in spite of me." That's her realizing what's going on. So that's the first kind of beat, is her realizing that they're all in on it. Secondly, "Injurious Hermia, most ungrateful maid, have you conspired? Have you with these contrived to bait me with this foul derision?" That is kind of furthering of that. So these are 2 beats that are kind of similar. She's saying, "Oh, wait, you're in on this as well." So I often recommend that you trim a little bit from there because you've already kind of covered, oh, we're all in on it. Now when she starts to talk about is all the counsel that we two have shared, she's introducing new information here. She's talking about how they grew up together. And she's saying, have you forgotten everything that we did together? This section is actually really important because it's kind of what the whole monologue is about, that Hermia and Helena were friends growing up, and now Hermia's kind of betraying her, or that's how she's seeing it. So that really needs to stay there so the audience understands what she's talking about throughout the rest of the monologue. You cut that and the audience is going to be very confused. So in your own monologue, when you're cutting, look for new information for the audience. If it's new information or if it's core to the monologue, don't cut that. After that, there are two beats coming up that are kind of similar. They're there because the first one sort of introduces the concept of all the things they used to do together as kids. So when she says, we, Hermia, like two artificial gods, and she's talking about them sewing together and she's painting the picture. Now that is a raise the stakes kind of moment where she's going into detail. After that, there's another beat that does sort of the same thing, where she says, so we grew together like to a double cherry, seeming parted, but yet a union in petition. That's, again, her becoming even more over the top, raising the stakes even more about how they're like one person. So those two chunks are about raising the stakes and help that arc kind of build for the character and for the actor. But they're kind of similar. So often in my cuts, I recommend that you can cut either one of those, but you need to make sure that if you're going to cut one of them, you're going to actually have to grow quite a lot in that time. You're going to have to make sure that that arc, which normally happens over 2 beats, happens over 1 beat. So that's quite big. That's a lot to do there as an actor. And that's why I kind of recommend try not to do that. Try and find a monologue that actually just naturally has its own arc that doesn't have to be condensed into one little thing. So I'll show you on screen here 2 different cuts that I recommend where you're working with only cutting things that have a similar function, meaning that they kind of achieve the same thing in the monologue. And here's where it gets even trickier. When it comes to cutting Shakespeare, you actually don't want to cut like half a line most of the time because of the iambic pentameter. Because it has a certain rhythm and flow to it, when you cut a half line, you're going to find that you have to sort of pause or sort of squish things together because there's something missing. You've taken out some of the rhythm. If you imagine like a song and someone just is like, just take a couple of words out, you'd be like, oh, but that's going to change. What am I going to do in that beat? I'm going to have to wait, right? You can't just remove things. You would have to wait for that space to be filled. So you've got 2 options for dealing with this. Either you put in a pause, and in that case, you really need to choose a moment where it's appropriate to pause. And I did that in version 1 of those cuts that I showed you before. That pause makes sense, and I often put a pause in there anyway before I go into and will you rent our ancient love asunder, even when I'm doing the full monologue, because it makes sense for her character to kind of take stock for a second and then keep going. So think about the appropriateness of pause in this case. And the second option, which I did in version 2, is to cut a half line up somewhere early on in the monologue and then another half line later on so they can fit together. So you can see here I've cut. So, oh, is it all forgot? It's a half line, and I've noted flow straight onto we grew together. I've taken out the so it ends up being a sort of mangled iambic pentameter of oh, is it all forgot? We grew together. That's the 5 beats. It's not amazing, but it's okay for flow. It's going to be enough beats to kind of keep me going. Now you might think this is really technical and maybe the panel won't care, and maybe they won't, but really what you want to notice is when you're cutting, do you feel at any point that you're having to sort of stop randomly? Are you feeling like it's difficult to build up the momentum that you need, either because you've got like a random half line or because it's just not long enough and the arc's not working for you? That's where you need to look at your cuts and go, this is not helping me. Overall, what you're working towards is something that helps you. If you're cutting and it feels gross, That's not Shakespeare, that's your cut. So try a different option. Or if you're struggling with something, drop me a comment here and I will see what I can do to help. Well done for getting through all that, because it is really tricky stuff. I'm also on Instagram and I'm doing a lot of sort of acting videos on there, practical stuff and sharing practical tips. So I'd love to see you on Instagram and connect. Otherwise, you can click to watch something else or subscribe, and I'll see you next time.